I don't know if everybody can hear me.
I think that's more for that.
That's what I thought. Okay. Go ahead and have a seat. Can everybody have a seat?
Hey, sweetie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? We're live. Are people to be able to make it?
Oh, yep, I made it.
So,
Yeah.
where's Walidah?
She's sitting down. I'm going to announce them right now.
Oh, okay. Wait a minute.
Okay.
I want to see her real quick.
She's right here.
Right.
Sitting right here.
That's why I couldn't see her, because I have on glasses.
Oh.
Okay.
Welcome. Can I have your attention? I'm going to be like a teacher. Everybody hold up their hands. One, 2, 3. Okay, everybody quiet down. Thank you. I felt like a teacher. I'm Debbie Castleton. I'm the chair of the Diverse and Empowered Employees of Portland. And welcome. Thank you for this great turnout. We have some special guests today. I'm very excited. I went to the Governing for Racial Equity conference recently. How many people here attended that? Excellent, excellent. Well, those of you that didn't are in for a special treat. This is a fantastic presentation, and we've also added Thomas Robinson to Walidah's presentation. So Walidah has taught courses on topics as diverse as the history of the Black Panther Party race and the history of prisons, Hurricane Katrina, and hip-hop as literature at Portland State University and throughout the country. Imarisha also filmed and co-directed Finding Common Ground in New Orleans, a documentary about Hurricane Katrina's aftermath. And Thomas Robinson, who will be following Walidah, is a photo archivist, and he tells important stories through historical photographs. So he has a wonderful presentation with his own photos. And I wanted to thank a couple people as well. Of course, the DEEP Executive Committee. And we have a partnership with the City of Portland's Civil Rights Program, so thank you, Shoshana. And a special thank you to OMF's Internal Business Services for help with funding and their support, and Portland Community Media, who's here filming, and I think we're actually on TV right now. So I will get off the stage and welcome Walidah. Thank you.
How's everyone doing? Good. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I can usually be pretty loud, so I think this is, I've been told my whole life to quiet down. So this is one place where I can get as loud as I want. So I'm really excited to be here. I was really happy to be part of the Governing for Racial Equity conference, and I'm excited to have that conversation continue throughout, city government and whoever's here who's not from the city. So I am excited to really present this timeline that I've created that focuses on Oregon Black history, but I believe Oregon Black history is Oregon history. I think this is also the history of race, identity, and power in Oregon, but also in the larger United States. So I just want a few disclaimers. The timeline that I'm going to show you is a much abbreviated version to try and keep it short so that we can hear from the other speaker and also so we can have time for dialogue and questions. The fuller timeline is in binders in the back, and it's also hung up along the back row. So at the end, if you want to take a look at it, I'll leave it up for a while. It's also available on YouTube, and that's the supersized version of the timeline. That's about 50 slides. And so if you just look on YouTube for Oregon Black History Timeline, it should be the first thing that pops up. And there are two versions, one with an audio commentary. So if you just can't get enough of me talking, I got you, right? And if you're like, no, that was lovely, and now, bring it down, I got you too. So there's one without an audio commentary. So just a little bit about my background. I'm not from Oregon. I grew up on military bases overseas. And even though I grew up in places like Iceland and Germany, because the military disproportionately recruits folks of color, and I grew up on bases, I grew up in communities that were, predominantly people of color. So I moved to Oregon for part of high school, and certainly the first question I asked was, why aren't there more black people in Oregon? And the second question was, should I be worried? We'll talk about both of those. But I was lucky enough while I was still in high school to attend a presentation by Dr. Darrell Milner when he spoke at the University of Oregon. Who here knows who Dr. Darrell Milner is? Great. Well, I hope that folks take time to research him. He is one of the preeminent historians of the history of black folks in the West, and really kind of the authority around the history of black folks in Portland and in Oregon. And he was one of the folks who actually started the Black Studies Department at Portland State University, where I get to teach. So I got to come full circle to have him as a colleague. And I want to definitely credit those folks who have done this work for decades. I call the subtitle of this is A Hidden History. And I think that there have been folks who have been working tirelessly to preserve this history, to maintain this history, and to make sure that it's available for those of us who are willing to do a little bit of digging, and hopefully we all continue to lift it up. So definitely want to give credit to that. So I think it's incredibly important that my timeline starts in the 1500s, the supersized version. I think it's incredibly important to look backwards. If we're only looking the past 10 or 20 years, we're not actually getting the full scope of what's happened here. We aren't able to see the cycles and patterns. I think a lot of folks talk about history as a sort of linear progression towards greatness, right? I think that actually history is more like a spiral. We're not in the same place, but if we look up, we can often see where we were. And I think that it is only by looking up that we can be able to make decisions about where we want to stand on that spiral as we move through it. So I think, again, the history of Oregon is an incredibly interesting history. I've met many folks who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union as a free state, as a state that outlawed slavery. The reality is actually a lot more complicated than that. So I'm sorry, Oregonians. I'm going to burst a few bubbles. So the history of Oregon is, yes, it is true that actually Oregon outlawed slavery before the rest of the country. Oregon outlawed slavery when it was still a territory in 1844, and slavery wasn't outlawed in the rest of the country until 1865. But the reality is we have to take a look at what was happening in the country during that time period. In the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, the biggest issue in this country was slavery. It is the issue that ultimately tore this country apart and that resulted in the bloodiest war that has ever happened on U.S. soil. So I think it's important. I think we often tell this very simplistic narrative that folks who were against slavery were good and the folks who were for slavery were bad. So I'm actually not going to talk very much about this part about the folks who were for slavery being bad. I'm not going to spend too much time disputing that, actually. But I do want to complicate this idea that the folks who were against slavery were good, right? So first I want to say that, again, I've said this before, I don't have the empirical data to back this up, but I'm willing to stake my reputation that, the overwhelmingly vast majority of black folks were anti-slavery during that time. And, and to be clear that they were anti-slavery for issues of justice and freedom, right? I think that that's really important to think about. I also think it's really important to recognize that there were many other folks who weren't black who were anti-slavery because of issues of justice and freedom. And so, white abolitionists like John Brown, folks who put their lives literally on the line because they thought that this was an unjust and immoral system that had to end. I think it's important to note there were many more people during that time who were pro-slavery, who actually felt that slavery was an institution that can continue forever, right? That there were actually folks who said, maybe we could do a little reforming to slavery. We could make a kinder, gentler slavery, right? I think this is important because I think that we often talk about slavery as, this institution that everyone knew had to be abolished, that everyone agreed at the time was, a horrendous, horrific institution. That's not the case, right? That's sort of historical revision. There were many folks at that time, white folks at that time, who were fine with slavery continuing on in perpetuity, right? And I think that that's important when we talk about institutional change. I think that when you're in the moment, it certainly looks different than when you're looking back 100 years. And I think that we certainly have some institutional change that is necessary now that in 100 years, folks are going to look back and say, well, of course that had to be changed. How could anyone argue with that at the time? But while we're in it, there are certainly folks who are arguing against some of the institutional change that's necessary that we'll be talking about. So I think it's also important to say that, so while there were white folks who were anti-slavery because of issues around freedom and justice, there were white folks who were anti-slavery because of issues of economics, right? That actually the majority of white folks who were anti-slavery because of economics. So that is because at that time, this country had two economic systems, right? Industrialized, free labor, usually indentured immigrant labor in the North, and then a system based on chattel slavery in the South. One country with two economic systems cannot continue. And so the question became, which economic system would prevail? And if you go back and read some of the commentaries that are in the newspapers at that time, you can see folks who have an economic investment in industrialization in the North, folks who are factory owners, folks whose names are on a lot of things, including some foundations, who, argued, or folks who were, speaking for them, argued against slavery, but because of economics. It was not an issue of justice. They were actually both anti-black and anti-slavery. And reading some of these commentaries, it's very interesting. Some of them are clearly focused on white working class folks and say things like, the reason that you can't get a job or the reason your wages are so incredibly low is not us. It's these slaves who are taking your jobs. Is that rhetoric that maybe we've heard a little bit recently, right? This is why I think history is a spiral, and it's important to recognize we've had these conversations before, right? So this idea of being anti-black and anti-slavery is where Oregon was actually born as a state, right? So even before Oregon became a state, it outlawed slavery in 1844 when it was a territory. But part of that also was that they banned black folks from moving to Oregon upon pain of public whipping every 6 months until black people left Oregon. So they were saying, we are anti-slavery because we don't want to deal with everything that goes with it. But to be clear, we are also anti-black, right? Oregon was actually founded as a white homeland, as a place where white folks could get away from the turmoil of the day, which they linked to people of color, to build the sort of white utopia that they dreamed of. This was the place white folks went to escape, right? And this is clearly reflected in things like, the lash law. Again, that black people were told they would be publicly whipped every 6 months until they left the state, right? Oregon is actually the only state in the Union to come in with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. And so when Oregon became a state, in its constitution, it banned any, free Negro mulatto not residing at the state at that time from living in Oregon, making contracts, or holding real estate. And I think it's incredibly important, this quote by a scholar, Egbert Oliver, says that black folks were essentially, he says illegal alien, I prefer undocumented people of the time. We were the first undocumented folks. We had no legal standing. Our very presence in Oregon was a criminal act. All you had to do to be a criminal in Oregon was be black, right? You could be, you know, the most upstanding citizen you wanted. You could be paying your taxes. You could be, you know, holding down a steady job, performing, you know, services for the community, and you were still a criminal in the eyes of the state. I think that this, you know, this is incredibly important when we begin to ask the question, why aren't there more black people in Oregon, right? And I also think it's important to recognize that this idea of the creation of a white homeland did not just affect the black community, right? It obviously affected all of us, but it clearly shaped other communities of color. So the mechanisms of control might have looked different depending on the needs of the dominant society, but all the communities of color have been shaped by this idea of Oregon as a white homeland. I think one of the other really important pieces of this is that this language was not removed from our Constitution until 2001. So until 2001, the Oregon Constitution banned black folks from coming here. Even though that language was inactive, it was still in the Constitution. And, you know, sometimes folks say, well, you know, Constitution's a big thing. They must have forgot. No, they didn't forget. There were not people sitting around a room like, oh my God, seriously, you didn't remove that? You said you were going to do it. Give me a pen, right? It was a fight to get this language removed, and it was something that came up in the legislature over and over and over again, brought by, you know, black folks in the community leaders, and supported by their allies, saying, can you remove this language because this is not the kind of state we want to live in? And again, the Oregon government reaffirmed, actually, this is the kind of state we want to live in. We want to leave this in here as a message, right? We are sending a message about the kind of community we want to create here. And for anyone who was here in 2001, and remember, it was a fight in 2001 to get this removed, right? And that the opposition who wanted to keep it in said that they wanted to preserve Oregon history, which many folks heard as wanting to preserve a history of you know, exclusion and white supremacy. And I think that, you know, we see that idea of leaving it as a message is not, this was not a one-off deal, right? That again and again, laws and language that could have been changed by the government were institutionalized to send this message. So we have the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment guaranteed universal citizenship rights to everyone, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights. And so this is a little social studies, you know, high school social studies, so forgive me. But to be clear, federal law supersedes state law, right? So federal law is the law of the land. So if state law is in conflict with federal law, it is invalidated when federal law is passed. But states can choose to ratify federal law, especially things like amendments, to say, yes, we agree with this. We think that this is the kind of state and country that we want to live in. And Oregon originally ratified the 14th Amendment guaranteeing universal citizenship rights, and then quickly de-ratified it, which honestly, until I did this research, I did not know you could actually de-ratify passing an amendment. And it was not ratified again until 1973. So that is over 100 years. Over 100 years that, again, Oregon reaffirmed this kind of state that we live in is one where there are not universal citizenship rights, where the citizenship rights are, you know, held are locked over here for the dominant society, for white people. And the same thing is true with the 15th Amendment as well. So again, I think it's important, especially for folks who are working for city government, who are working for government, to recognize the ways that these city government has been utilized and state government has been utilized to institutionalize this kind of exclusion and containment and reinforce it again and again. And I think, actually, wait a minute. So I think, obviously, we think that this is important information. Hopefully, that's why you're here, because we live in Oregon, right? But I think it's actually important information as a case study for the larger society, because the ideas that founded Oregon are the same ideas that founded the United States. The United States as a nation was founded as a white homeland, right? And if you go back and read the text from those folks who came and colonized, This is the undergirding of manifest destiny, right? The idea that God gave this land to white folks to make profitable, and that they had the right to do anything necessary to indigenous folks to take that land because they weren't using it properly, right? Including enslave African folks and bring them here to work as chattel slavery. That is the creation of our nation, is the creation of a white homeland. Oregon is reflective of that. So we can look at Oregon as a very useful case study, because the thing about Oregon that is unique, really the only thing about Oregon that is unique, is that they were bold enough to write it down. Right? But these same ideologies, practices, and principles shaped every state in this nation as well as this larger nation. So Oregon is useful because they wrote it down and reaffirmed it again and again, so we don't have to, say, well, this is what I think they were saying, or this is what I feel like that. They were like, no, look, we'll write it down again, just in case you didn't get it the first time. And I think that it's important to recognize that the mechanisms of control that were used in Oregon to control this black population that was free and unwanted are ultimately the same mechanisms that were used to control the larger black population once slavery ended in this country. So Jim Crow slavery, or Jim Crow segregation, was much more advanced in Oregon because folks had been practicing it for a couple decades before the end of slavery. So in many ways, sadly, Oregon is a precursor and an example for the rest of the country about how to control this black population when slavery is no longer an option. And in fact, this leads to Oregon being called things like the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And I think one really useful example to look at is the example of the Klan. I think that, again, we tell historical inaccuracies about the Klan, that we really simplify this narrative to make ourselves more comfortable. So the way that we talk about the Klan is that the Klan is something that existed up until the 50s and 60s in the rural South. It was predominantly working class, uneducated, rural Southern white men, and by and large, it has died out, right? None of those are true, honestly. So the Ku Klux Klan at its height had a membership of 15% of the eligible population of America, which meant white men. So 15% of white men were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan at its height in the 1920s. So, Amnesty International doesn't have 15% of the population. And the Humane Society, right? We love puppies, we love kitties, they don't have 15%, right? So I think it's incredibly important to recognize what 15% of the population means. And that Oregon had the highest per capita Klan membership in the country. And again, this is at a time where the black population was about 2,500 people, maybe, right? So the question becomes, why would so many folks want to be card-carrying members of the Klan? Again, it is about sending a message about the kind of community folks want to live in by saying, by this membership in the Klan, this is part and parcel of the kind of community I want to live in. I think the other piece about this is that often folks say, okay, well, there were a lot of stupid people in the country. 15% of the population of white men were stupid, whatever, right? I think it's incredibly important to recognize that the reach of the Klan reached to the highest levels of power, both in Oregon and in the larger nation. So actually, Oregon had a Klan governor. Walter Pierce was a card-carrying member of the Klan, and he was elected in 1922. And with the support of the Klan, they were actually able to push forward legislation. Specifically, one of the pieces that was important was the Compulsory Education Act, which focused on public schools. This is at a time when the institutions that shape every single one of our lives were really becoming solidified, right? What does public education mean? How does that function? How do we engage with that? The fact that the Klan was powerful enough to pass legislation to want to control the curriculum in all public schools is incredibly important when we talk about institutional racism in things like public education now. We have to look back further than just 10 or 20 years. We have to look back to the foundations of these institutions. we also have to recognize, again, Oregon is a reflection of the larger nation. During this time, the president was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States. Woodrow Wilson wrote a pro-Klan history book where he glorified the rise of the Klan. It actually became the foundation for the book that became the foundation for the film Birth of a Nation. So his recording of the rise of the Klan became the foundation for this film, Birth of a Nation, which is the most virulently racist Klan propaganda film, I'm going out on a limb, that has ever been made. And Birth of a Nation was the first film ever screened in the White House. And Woodrow Wilson would screen this pro-Klan propaganda film to visiting dignitaries to say, this is what we're dealing with. In many ways, to try and counteract the incredible work that was happening in black communities to raise awareness nationally, internationally, to say, this is the condition that black folks are living under. We need international support. Woodrow Wilson screened the film to say, no, this is what they're really like, actually, and this is why we need organizations like the Klan. So I think, again, it's an incredibly important piece of our history to look at about how far this reached and the deep ways that it's embedded into our institutions. I want to talk a little bit specifically about the black community, because I think it's incredibly important to make sure that we are not framing black communities in Oregon as passive victims. And if you leave here with nothing else other than the fact that remember, Oregon excluded black people, 2001, and black folks were not passive victims, and my job will be done. So the very fact that there are communities of color at all speaks to the resilience of those communities of color, and especially the black community whose very identity was criminalized. The fact that there are black communities in Oregon is a testament to resistance, to community building, and to some immense courage, right? And to look at the kind of flow of the history, and I know that our other speaker is going to talk more about gentrification and the changing black communities, so I'm not going to focus as much on that, but I think it's important to really take a look at this history. So the first, really big black community in Portland, and the majority of black folks in Oregon live in Portland, and that's certainly not to discount the folks in other areas, but that's always been the case. The first large-ish, let's say, collection of black folks in Portland came with the end of the transcontinental railroads in the 1880s. The vast majority of black folks in Portland worked for the railroads. And again, in a city that was called the most segregated city, north of the Mason-Dixon line, where black folks could not, sleep in any of the hotels downtown, where they could not eat at any of the restaurants in downtown Portland, couldn't go to the doctor, couldn't get their hair cut, couldn't get their teeth checked, none of these, things that we need to do on an everyday basis. There arose a black community, businesses that were small but thriving around the train station, right? And the keystone of this was the Golden West Hotel. And that was really created to house, those black railway workers. And so again, I think many folks don't recognize the first black community in Portland was downtown. It was around the train station. And at that time, no one else wanted to live there, right? It was loud, it was dirty. Folks were like, hey, y'all have that, that's yours, right? And I also want to just say that the Golden West Hotel, the building is still standing, and there's actually an exhibit that you can look at that shows more about that community. So I'd encourage everyone to go look at it. It's just over Burnside and to the left. I don't have great. Yes, yeah, it's in Northwest. It's by Union Station. So I don't have a great sense of direction. Y'all should look it up. But so, this was kind of, the foundation of the first black community. And, folks were there until that land suddenly became desirable, right? As downtown expanded, suddenly folks said, hey, this is actually premium land. And the black community was dislocated, right? And I like to say dislocated rather than relocated, because to me, dislocated is like breaking a bone. It's painful, and unless it's set properly, it won't ever heal properly. And I think that the black community in Portland has been dislocated again and again and again. So part of the, the idea of where were folks going to go after they were dislocated from being around Union Station was the fact that there were laws such as redlining, right, which literally referred to drawing a red line on a map and saying that people of color could only live within that line, right? It was about legal segregation and control and containment. So folks like the Portland Real Estate Board Code of Ethics mandated that real estate agents were not allowed to sell to individuals whose race was determined to lower the property value in the neighborhood. And then a few years later, they were like, maybe that wasn't clear enough. Maybe y'all are keeping out, I don't know, the Irish. Let's be clear. We mean black folks and Asian folks. They spelled it out very clearly, right? So this is why the historic black community is in the Albina neighborhood, because this was where folks were redlined to, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that, that community was created out of intense segregation, and yet, again, in terms of not being passive victims, but folks built an incredibly strong community within that. The other large influx of black folks, which my fellow speaker will speak more to, came during World War II to Vanport. How many people know what Vanport is? All right, I like y'all, good job. So, Vanport, was a constructed city, constructed to house workers. It was multiracial, but especially to house black workers because there was no space in Albina. It was already full, and there was a huge influx of folks coming in. At its height, Vanport was 100,000 people. 40% of those were black, right? And so it is incredibly interesting that this was the second largest city and that it was 40% black. When I first read this, I was like, man, somebody needed to copy edit this. It said 40 and they meant 4. That is shoddy scholarship. And then I was like, my bad. So, I won't talk too much about this, but I mean, Vanport is a keystone for black history. And I think that even when we do learn about these, tiny pieces of Oregon history in public schools, like Vanport, it's not framed in that way. It is not framed as this is actually where the sizable population of black folks came from that created enough of a community that in many ways, the city of Portland suddenly had to change the tactics and ways it was engaging with the black community because the numbers were large enough that in many ways, there had to be more dialogue and discussion than there had been in the past. And so Vanport was destroyed in 1948. And so the question then became, where would those folks go? And we see the changing lines around Albina, northeast Portland, to expand, to take in folks who, more than tripled the black population at that time. So we see that, in 1960, 4 out of 5 black folks lived in Albina, and again, that this was a strong community where folks had, built institutions to serve the needs that were not being met by the larger institutions of society. And, this continued until the construction of the Memorial Coliseum in 1956 and the introduction of the highways, which were dropped directly on the heart of the black community. So right now, under the Memorial Coliseum, under the Rose Garden or the Moda Center or whatever name it has next week, that was the heart of the black community. And North Williams, which was, the artery of the black community, was literally cut in half. And that community was left to die, right? And I got to do this presentation, and a young woman said that her grandfather's house had been there. And he took her and walked her around the concession stand and said, this was so-and-so's house, and over here was your auntie's house, and over there, right? And the very lived reality that under that concrete was the heart of the black community. And so while folks were still reeling from that, there was another blow dealt, this time by Emmanuel Hospital, who got federal funding to expand the hospital, right? Which in theory sounds like a great thing, expansion of a hospital, expansion of services. Unfortunately, they did not engage in communication with the community and instead gave folks 90 days to move out of their homes before they demolished thousands of housing units. And so homeowners were given a maximum of $15,000, which was about $1,000 less than the median value of houses at that time. Renters were given $4,000. And again, this is 90 days to move your entire life out of this community that you have been building that, folks had lived in for generations. I think one of the most I mean, everything about this is terrible, but I think one of the most terrible pieces is that the federal funding ran out. It ran out after demolition, but before construction. And so anyone who's been in Portland for any length of time knows that that neighborhood stayed like that, not for a couple years, for decades. For decades, that neighborhood stayed like that. And in fact, there's construction happening right now, right, around Emmanuel Hospital. Some of that construction was part of the 1970 plan. So again, when we talk about this, this is not a history. This is a living legacy that is affecting every single one of our lives today. And this is, I think, a perfect example for city folks to think about the complicity of the city in this around the taking of these thousands of homes and the demolition of that, right? I think it's really important, I think that a lot of times folks talk about North and Northeast Portland, I've heard it referred to as the wild, wild North, actually. And this idea of it being a gang-infested, gang-riddled, dangerous drug zone. I think it's incredibly important, to first recognize the ways that those languages are all coded racial languages, right? Let's be clear. But I think it's also incredibly important to recognize this history, because we can't understand North and Northeast Portland in the 1980s without seeing, these massive blows that were dealt to that community. Recognizing that across this nation there was an economic collapse that was hardest hitting communities of color, working class communities, right? And that in the Albina district, houses were assessed at half or less than their original values. That landlords who didn't live there, right, slumlords, were actually abandoning their houses because it wasn't worth it to them to pay the property taxes. The houses weren't worth what they were paying in taxes on those houses, and so they abandoned them, right? At the same time, we see that this is the period where jobs are moving overseas, right? These industrial jobs, these factory jobs that had kept many working class folks, and especially working class communities of color, able to sustain and support families and communities, had moved overseas to exploit third world labor. So in some neighborhoods, there was 60 to 80% unemployment, right? Especially in black communities. And so we can't understand the introduction of, the underground drug economy as survival tactics, as an underground economic system, or as a form of self-medication without understanding this larger context that is happening around this. And I think, my timeline ends in 1996, so I'm really excited that Thomas's piece brings us up to the present, because I already have 50 slides. I can't do any more, y'all. But I think that now we've talked a lot about gentrification, right? I think it's important to recognize gentrification is a national phenomenon. It is something that has been happening for decades, and that the plans were set in motion even before we saw the signs of gentrification in communities. And I think, again, if we're only looking back 10 or 20 years, we can't hope to understand what's happening. But I think it's important that, in areas like Albina, the black community demanded that the city provide support, right? Saying, we are citizens, we are taxpayers, we need resources. This is the job of the city to support us. And so the city of Portland, like many other cities, began a revitalization project, right? Urban renewal. And the end result of that was that after about 10 years of that black folks owned 36% fewer homes in that neighborhood, and that white folks had 43% more homes in that neighborhood. So I think it's incredibly important to ask, who are these neighborhoods being revitalized for, right? And that we see that communities of color, and the black community specifically, have been split, right? That this dislocation has happened again, but that this time folks have gone in separate directions, right? So north to even out of the state into Vancouver, Washington, or outer east into the Numbers, into Gresham, right? So we actually see a fragmentation of the community happening, with the reality that there are still black folks in North and Northeast Portland. I definitely want to break this narrative that, it's gone, it's taken. It's not gone, it's not taken. And we have some in the audience. And that, many of these institutions that the black community built to sustain itself are in North and Northeast Portland. And what does it mean that folks have to, take the train in an hour from Gresham, or an hour and a half bus ride to be able to access these services? I think it's incredibly important when we're talking about gentrification that we actually recognize that in addition to North, and to Outer East, there is another place that the Black community has been dislocated to, and that is to the prison system, into prisons. And things like Measure 11 have sped that along, that Black folks are disproportionately incarcerated under Measure 11, especially Black youth being tried as adults under Measure 11. And so when we talk about the Black community, it is incredibly important for me that we do not forget that our community actually extends into those prison walls. And it's also incredibly important to recognize that this, this criminalization, the utilization of the criminal justice system, in many ways is an extension of the criminalization of Black identity that Oregon is founded on, right? To be Black was to be a criminal. And that when we look at the numbers of who is charged with the Measure 11, who is convicted, who serves long sentences, what youth are tried as adults under Measure 11, we see these echoes of those same exact ideologies, that to be Black is to be presumed a criminal. Right? I want to just skip through. I have some state of Black Oregon statistics in this presentation, but they're actually on handouts in the back, so I'm just going to go through it. But I think when we talk about this history, it's important to recognize these statistics are the result of that. The fact that the disparities between Black communities and white communities are growing in Oregon and across the nation every year is not, it's not an anomaly. Right? This is a direct repercussion of this history that we are looking at. And so, when we see that, the Black median income is $30,000 while the white median income is $46,800, right? That is an immense disparity. That 38% of Black children live below the poverty line. Right? That when we talk about public education intersecting with criminalization, Black students are suspended or expelled at twice the rate as white students in Portland public schools, right? And again, these are in the back, so you don't have to be like, I didn't get to read them all. And that Black folks are incarcerated at 6 times the rate as white folks in Oregon, which is also representative of the larger national statistics as well. And this piece around health is, I think, incredibly important, that Black babies are 50% more likely to be born with low birth weight or infant mortality than white babies. This is incredibly important because these disparities exist regardless of class, right? That there is a disparity between infant mortality and low birth weight among Black babies and white babies, even for wealthy Black women. I think this is incredibly important because I think that often, we want to shift to talk about class rather than race. And we have to talk about class, and we have to talk about the intersections of race and class. But this statistic shows that we actually have to talk about race in isolation, that there is something about being Black in this society that is living in women's bodies, in all of our bodies, but is clearly manifesting in women's bodies in a way that is literally killing the next generation. And that has to be talked about in isolation around race because it is not tied to completely to class. The last piece I want to just leave with is that, again, it's incredibly important to recognize the Black community is not passive victims, that every instance of repression has bred folks resisting, creating community, and engaging in some of the most creative, innovative ways of survival and growth. And I think, it's incredibly important to recognize that that agency of Black folks, because I think otherwise then we fall into this idea that Black people need to be saved. And instead of recognizing that Black folks specifically and communities of color in general actually need to be at the center of our organizing work, of our re-envisioning of the future, because they have the framework to be able to create societies that actually benefit all of us. So I feel like I'm adding to the list of things I want you all to remember, but I really want you all to remember that, what communities of color in general and Black communities need specifically is not saviors, they need allies, right? They need folks who are willing to take the leadership and experience and ingenuity of those communities and follow that lead. So what folks need is not saviors, it's allies. And some of that history shows in 1867, the school board in Salem refused to allow Black students to attend. And so while folks were suing the city of Salem in the court system, they actually started their own separate school and said, if you're not going to educate our children, we will. And I think it's incredibly important that they raised $427.50. 50 cents, y'all, that's important. 1867, $427.50 money. I don't know how to do all of the mathematical translation. That's a lot of money, especially for a community that at this time had no legal standing in this state. And they were still able to raise that money to build institutions that ultimately forced the city of Salem to take over running that and to force public education to be open to all, even if at that time it was segregated. I think this example of Maxville is very interesting, that, 1923, that there was a community of loggers that formed a community in Maxville. To me, I'm like, man, folks create community anywhere, right? But I also think the important piece is that one of the daughters of the loggers, Gwen Trice, is working to preserve that history. There's a documentary on OPB that I think you can actually watch online called The Logger's Daughter, about that history and about her work to preserve that site and to make it a space that folks can go to lift up that hidden history and to recognize that work is ongoing and still happening. The other thing is, who knew Portland was a jazz treasure? See, again, I like y'all. Most people are like, Oregon, really? So, Portland was a jazz treasure that all of the greats played here. Everyone wanted to play here. It was an underground secret that, folks coming from Seattle, going down to the Bay were like, we got to stop in Portland, y'all. I demand that we stop in Portland. And so, I think, again, that out of this immense segregation at this time, the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line, folks created a culture that everyone wanted to participate and share in. And my last slide that I want to share focuses on the history of the Black Panther Party. How many people knew we had a Black Panther Party in Portland? All right, less hands, but still, I still like y'all. So, I teach a class on this, so I'm not going to go too far in depth. But, the Black Panther Party was a national organization. They had 2 programs that existed in almost every one of their 50 chapters. One was a free breakfast program for children, and in fact, in 1969, the attorney for California said that the Black Panther Party fed more children than the United States government every day. And then they had a health clinic that was free and open to everyone who came in. It didn't matter your race. It didn't matter if you had insurance. They didn't ask any questions except, what's wrong with you and how can we fix you? And Portland actually had one of the longest running health clinics. They had 2, and one of them was the longest running one. And one of them was actually their dental clinic was taken over by OHSU and is still operating as a low-income health clinic. And I think that this is incredibly important because it recognizes that when we center those folks who have been marginalized, when we support the leadership of folks who have been marginalized, who have been left out of the other institutions, it actually creates institutions that benefit our entire community. That because of this work by these folks who did not get any government funding, did not get any grant money, right, that operated solely on donations and love and I'm sure a lot of coffee, that they were able to build this institution that has lasted for decades and is still providing a beneficial service to our community. So, that's the last thing I want y'all to remember, that when we center those folks who have been marginalized, it actually makes our communities stronger, wholer, and better for all of us. So thank y'all so much, and I want to turn it over.
Thanks, I needed that. My name's Tom Robinson. I've lived in Portland since 1975. I'm an archivist and historian, and a longtime resident of the Northeast Portland area. And in 2009, Donna Maxey, who runs Race Talks, asked me to produce a slide lecture about the history of relations between Portland's Black community and the Portland city government. So there. This is a 1917 photo of the Shiloh Baptist Church at Northeast 74th and Everett. Before World War I, blacks were dispersed throughout the east side. they were close to where they worked or farmed. Those who worked for the railroad settled on the east side between Broadway and Steel Bridges. And that was until what Walidah described as the real estate covenant that introduced organized segregation into Portland. This is Tom Johnson sitting at the place of honor at the front of the bar, and he was a realtor, a black realtor, who is the person who subsidized hundreds of homes for black families in that area, the Albina district. At this time, this is a 1943 photo, at this time Portland had about 2,000 black residents. Within 2 years, 15,000 more blacks moved to Portland to work in the shipyards. Kaiser had sent recruiters east and south to find workers, and they chartered special trains to bring them to Portland. They created a new city to house them called Vanport. In 1948, Vanport flooded. This was Oregon's second largest city. The largest population of blacks in Oregon lived here, even more than in Albina. It was the biggest disaster in the nation that year. Because of the segregation, the blacks at Vanport had nowhere else to go but Albina. But Albina was already full, if not overcrowded. The two other black wartime housing projects were at Swan Island, which was also destroyed by the same flood, and Giles Lake, which was being dismantled for industrial redevelopment. This is the Red Cross trying to reunite the families and lost people from Vanport, find them a place to stay and food to eat. But many were forced to move away because of segregation. Now I'd like to talk about the dismantling of the Albina district. This is the War Memorial in Portland's park blocks. It was a billboard, and it had the name of every Oregon soldier that died during World War II. The city wanted to build a permanent version of this somewhere. The neighborhoods that were suggested that made the most sense were the South Auditorium, Delta Park, Selwood, and Northwest. The city created a committee to study the choices, which was called the Exposition and Recreation Committee. But the East Side businessmen wanted to site it right where the black community was because they were building the Lloyd Center, which became the largest shopping center in the nation. They wanted a white corridor from downtown to the Lloyd Center, and so the War Memorial became the poster child for their campaign. This is an aerial of the Albina district before they raised it to build the Memorial Coliseum. That's the Broadway Bridge at the bottom and a steel bridge at the top. And this is Duke Ellington. He's having his 54th birthday at McClendon's Rhythm Room on Williams Avenue. This is the epicenter of the black entertainment district that Bob Dietschy wrote about in his book, Jumptown. Williams Avenue was the black Broadway. And there goes the neighborhood. After stripping away 476 houses, the Coliseum is in, and the heart of the black community is gone, including their entire business district, their churches, and community centers. Now, looking below the Coliseum, what they're doing is excavating I-5. That took out another 125 houses. All the residences from the river up to Victoria Street were taken out, leaving only 3 blocks left before getting to Union Avenue, which is now MLK. And soon most of those were gone. The I-5 freeway project made a trench 2 blocks wide from the Coliseum going up the hill almost to Interstate, and then went north to the Columbia River. Much of what you can see in this picture was knocked out to build the Kaiser Hospital. 1962 comes around, and there's still organized segregation going on in Portland, and black people can't get housing. This is the NAACP petitioning the Housing Authority of Portland in May 1962. Housing Authority had announced a low-income housing project known as Daisy Williams to be built in the Albina neighborhood. They did this without a single public meeting about it. Segregation is still the core issue here. Here we are at City Hall a year later. See the sign on the right that says subtle segregation? That was the word for what the Housing Authority was doing. The issue was a new housing development called Northwest Towers at 19th and Flanders. HAP officially stated that the project was not segregated. But the project was about to open with 100% white occupancy. How did that happen? HAP started taking applications in 1959, but didn't tell black people that they could apply until the project was already full. President Kennedy was scheduled to personally dedicate the building with the mayor and the governor. The NAACP sent a telegram about segregation to Kennedy's press secretary, and the president canceled his visit. One of the most damning events to befall the black community in Portland was Emanuel. In 1962, the Portland Development Commission had published the Central Albina Study, which found the Albina district to be a worthless slum and proposed clearance to avoid the spread of slums to adjacent neighborhoods. Their solution was to bulldoze it and move in cement warehouses and parking lots. This area was home for 80% of Portland's black population. With Emanuel, they found a perfect partner to do this. Emanuel wanted to add 19 acres to their campus. The Portland Development Commission got a grant from the Model Cities program to make an urban renewal district for Emanuel that would take away about 10 blocks of housing and businesses. Let's talk about the Model Cities program. Originally, the Model Cities Citizens Planning Board Committee had a black director, Alvin Batiste. In January 1970, he was fired by Mayor Shrunk over a fight Batiste was having with the Portland Development Commission. The issue was that the PDC had loaded the planning committee with people who were not from the community, but who instead were from the PDC itself. In other words, the PDC put their own members on their own advisory board, which Batiste said, and I quote, would exert colonial rule over the committee. Mayor Shrunk simply appointed a political operative to replace the fired director, but the black community strenuously objected to the clearance of the Albina neighborhood for Emanuel. The issues became so contentious that the next Model Cities meeting was closed to the public and the press, and there, Mayor Shrunk stripped it of its voting power and made it an advisory committee. This photo was shot at the next meeting after that, on June 5th, which was also the last meeting of the Model Cities Citizens Planning Board. The PDC decided to do an end run around Model Cities and obtained an exemption from participating in it. This ended all of Portland's responsibility for involving the community in deciding their own fate. 25 days after this photo was taken, the PDC released the news that federal authorization for the funding to acquire all the houses and buildings for Emanuel had come through. Planning of the demolition of 209 houses and other buildings would now begin. This is Williams and Russell in January 1968. The onion-shaped dome on the tall building now rests on display in Dawson Park. This was the heart of the Williams Avenue Business District. Now you see it, now you don't. 209 houses, 9 square blocks, over 1,000 people displaced. Just as the bulldozers finished their work, the news arrived that the funding for the Emanuel construction had failed the vote in Congress. All of this destruction was for nothing. Emanuel never used any of this land. The demolitions had occurred before the funding was approved. The political machine behind it was unstoppable. The PDC refused all further community proposals to use the land, even for parks. This is where the notorious Possum Incident happened in April 1981. 2 Portland police officers tossed 4 dead opossums on the front steps at night. Their commander fired them. 2 months later, they were reinstated by an arbitrator, and there was an outcry from the black community that brought demonstrations into the streets. The building is still there. You might recognize it. It houses Christopher's. Continuing problems. Continuing problems with the police led to the formation of a coalition of black men in August 1988. This photo shows them marching east on Killingsworth at the corner of Mississippi. Let's talk about gentrification. If we had to pick one moment when it began, it would probably be the Rexall Rose Cafe on 24th in Alberta. In the summer of 1997, it opened on what was then a dead commercial thoroughfare. As the thinking went, if this could work, anything could. Shops catering to nearby whites sprouted up on Alberta, on Mississippi, and then upscale restaurants offering cocktails, soon art galleries, and then the last Thursday. Within a decade, almost all the black-owned stores would succumb to the high rents and gentrification. There is nothing inherently wrong with change. But what about the community that lives there? What started as infilling vacant properties turned into a predatory gold rush. The new investors were not interested in serving the community. They wanted to attract other people to come and replace the community. They wanted a class change. In Portland, as far as black people are concerned, urban renewal consistently has meant displacing black families, destroying their homes, and evicting their businesses. Gentrification is the practice of replacing them with businesses and housing that are designed to serve more upscale Portland residents. And while we're here, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the photographer who's here today, Jenny Ankney. Jenny spent a lot of time in the 1990s photographing these neighborhoods before they were gentrified, and she has the best collection of photos I've seen. Here's a 1974 photo of the Walnut Park Theater. This is the building on the lot proposed for Trader Joe's. You can see by the red car sitting on blocks next to it that this is a dilapidated property. So why did the black community have a protest march when Trader Joe's announced they were developing this property? The black community protests about Trader Joe's were not because they didn't want the grocer. The protests began after the black community has exhausted every avenue to get the city government to engage them in planning for the development of the block. And once again, just like the Kennedy incident, the city made its deal with Trader Joe's before they even had a single meeting with the neighborhood to talk about it. The unwillingness of the city planners to involve the black community in the planning for this block forced the protest march that brought the issues of race, gentrification, and community to the surface again. That's my talk. Thank you.
So So we have a little bit of time for questions and comments and ideas and thoughts if folks have them. Yes. Thank you.
Giving that balanced response, many folks want to blame it on the health. It wasn't about not wanting the grocery store, so I really appreciate you doing that. Really,
I'm sorry, I just want to repeat because we are recording, so I want to make sure that folks hear your insightful comments. So just that was appreciative about the piece around Trader Joe's, that it was not about not wanting the store there, but it was about wanting to be involved in the process and centering the community, that it wasn't about one organization, but about the process itself.
And my question for you is, in response to all of this information, do you have any thoughts on that Atlantic article, reparations?
So the question is, do we have thoughts about the Atlantic article that was published recently about reparations? I was like, I guess I'll talk about reparations. I think it's an important conversation. I think that the framing around community reparations is really important, right? That it's not about sending a check to every single Black person, but it's about how do we, right the wrongs that have been done and the repercussions of those wrongs that are continuing today. Again, this is a living legacy. So I think it's incredibly important that, when the Civil War ended in 1865, Black folks were, freed, except that the 13th Amendment offered the loophole that slavery could continue in the case of punishment. So we see the rise of the prison system then. But Black folks were suddenly free with no economic basis, right? I'm sure most folks have heard this idea of 40 acres and a mule, that there was a proposal to give every former enslaved Black person 40 acres and a mule, right? Which at that time, land was money. And so having that would mean an economic base for each family to begin to build up from. That never happened. And so what we see is, in many ways, the reinstitution of a slavery system through sharecropping, through Black folks having to sell their labor to white landowners to work it, and at the end of the season, somehow they're further in debt in money to those white landowners, so they can never work off their debt. So they are in perpetuity slaves to that land, right? So when we talk about reparations, the reality is it's not about something that was, done a long time ago. It's the reality that the economic condition of Black folks in this country is based on not ever being given an economic basis after centuries of theft of labor and our very lives. And so I think it's incredibly important for America to recognize America would not exist as it is without the enslaved Black labor that it got, it didn't get for free, right? There were some serious costs that we are still dealing with. But America would not have become a superpower without the theft of native land and the enslavement of Black labor. And that is to me the conversation around reparations. It's not about, Black folks just want a check, right? The reality is Angela Davis wrote a great short book called Abolition Democracy, where she said, and kind of expanding on this idea that Frederick Douglass said, that abolition is not just the end of something, it is the replacement of that with justice, right? So abolition, true abolition of slavery, didn't happen in this country because it was not just about the end of legal slavery, but it was the institution of justice for those folks who were enslaved. And that never happened economically, politically, or socially in this country. And so Frederick Douglass's, theory, which Angela Davis continued, was that we actually never had real abolition of slavery. We just had an end to legal slavery, which is not the same. And I think that this conversation that's, sprouting up again around reparations is around this idea of, what does true justice look like? As MLK said, peace is not the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice. And I think that we confuse these things often. And I think this is an important conversation for us to have here and for folks in the city to have, right? To have the question of what does real justice look like? It's not enough to say, well, we took that law off the books, right? That's not on the books anymore, so I don't know what else folks want. Right? It's not about saying, well, we said sorry, right? It's what does real justice look like in practice, in body, in form. Yes.
I'd like to thank both of you all for putting such a long timeline in such a short period of time. And like to also recognize that I only heard the phrase people of color once. And I'd like to give folks who make decisions something else to speak about. The only reason we have these discussions is because of the treatment of black people, not the treatment of people of color. And when we have these discussions, we need to recognize that and talk about the conditions of black folks when we make recommendations for solutions.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. And I think I definitely use the term people of color a few times. That my timeline focuses on Oregon Black history because that's my area of scholarship. But I do think it's incredibly important to recognize this mentality of a white homeland with everything that came with it has shaped every community of color and has controlled, contained, and exploited every community of color in Oregon. And the longer timeline actually has a lot more slides that look at the experiences of Mexican folks during World War II who were, imported as, cheap labor, exploited, basically kept in camps and forced to work upon threat of being shot, and that actually every work camp in the Northwest had some sort of uprising against those behaviors by those folks in the camps. I think that's incredibly important, the fact that that's often erased from the reality of our history, but also, again, not just the repression of the work camps, but the resistance to it. So, I focus on Oregon Black history because this is my area of expertise. I also think that we live in a black-white hierarchy, so oftentimes folks are pushing against blackness. But I do think it's incredibly important to recognize the experiences of communities of color across the board, and that we actually have many shared experiences given the creation and mentality of this white homeland. Yeah.
I have a question. So talking about race makes people uncomfortable to the extent that people can't even have, substantive, even candid conversations around it. Based on your experience, how does a diverse group frame or introduce or begin to have conversations? I think in many ways we can talk about the legacy and get a grasp and have a sense of what's happened, but there's this so what, that conversations around race are just hard to have. So based on your experiences, how does a group come up with that framework? What are the tools and techniques to say, this is the issue at hand, how do we discuss and collective change?
Well, Donna Maxey's Race Talks is a great example of that in action. And I believe they do this monthly, and the people who attend sit in groups and talk very non-judgmentally about the issues and try and get an understanding of them. And they have these at the Kennedy School, and I've made a couple of presentations there, and I'm really quite impressed at how many people they get and how they cut through a lot of things that how they get people to think and talk in groups. That's one example, I think.
And I think making sure and framing this as a living legacy is incredibly important, right? To really remove this from history. So I think when it's history, people say, well, that's interesting. So what, right? I think when we say this is a living legacy, and it's part of why I appreciate, bringing it all the way up to something that, was very recent, and making those connections to, the actions of PDC with Emmanuel, making the connections to the actions around the Memorial Coliseum to say, that's why so what? Because actually we've had these exact same conversations here before in that spiral. I really think one of the other things that we have to do is move beyond Portland nice, y'all. We gotta... I love that y'all let people go in front of you when we're driving, and we're all at the stop sign. No, you go. No, you go. I feel like there's some great places for Portland nice. I don't think dealing with institutionalized racism and enacting real change and justice is one of the places for Portland Nice. I think that we actually have to have real conversations. Part of the reason I call my program, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon, rather than saying an exploration of diversity and a history of, is because I don't want to use that language, right? Because I feel it's actually ineffective. What it does is it spreads it out in this diffused way that we don't even actually know what we're talking about. When people say diversity, they mean everything from race to, gender to sexual identity to people riding bikes to folks with piercings and tattoos, right? I'm like, I don't actually even know what diversity means anymore. So I actually think we just need to be very clear about what we're saying and have really honest, real conversations that result in institutionalized change, right? It's not enough to sit around and have listening circles, right? It's not enough to have these projects where all we do is listen. It has to result in not only just change, but institutionalized change. To get to these things like the Klan shaping our public education system, to say, this happened in 1920, so some sort of surface change is not going to be enough. We have to dig deep. We're going to have to pull up some roots. It might be painful and it's going to be dirty, hard work, but at the end of the day, we can actually plant something new in this ground that won't die the minute it tries to take root. So without institutionalized change, yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate your timeline. Was very on point because I'm first generation. My parents came here after World War II, and the whole Vanport thing and what you were talking about, how my mom and my dad used to always say that they were expecting them to go back to the South, that they had made a home for themselves here. But looking at the timeline and what's really sad, because I still live in Northeast Portland, and when you say that this is a great place, what you were saying, I have to put my glasses on, I'm sorry. A good place for white people, even in Northeast now, I still feel that when I go into some of the restaurants and try to patronize some of the places there, I get that look like you still live here. You're still in Northeast Portland, you have not been pushed back. So like you said, we still have a lot of things that we need to dig up for people that are still living within Northeast Portland. And it just kind of seems like we're going back through that timeline again when we, like you said, change is good, and bringing some of the old with the new is a good thing, but we're still there, and we have a long ways to go still, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point is really, really important, that there's black community in North and Northeast Portland. And I feel like I often hear folks, talking about it, and specifically white folks talking about it in sad terms, right? Like, it's really sad that this neighborhood has been completely gentrified and black folks don't live here anymore. In many ways, I feel like that's the same rhetoric around, well, there are no more indigenous people, they were all killed off, it's really sad. But that means all we have to do is mourn. We don't actually have to deal with those folks who are organizing in their communities, creating resistance, and deal with what does justice mean like for those communities who have resisted for 500 years and are continuing to resist, right, indigenous communities. The same thing I feel like is true for the mentality around gentrified communities, right, that if all the black folks are gone from North and Northeast Portland, then all we have to do is put up a few memorials. Think about that when we go by to get our latte and to go to last Thursday, right? But if we recognize, actually, not only are there still black folks in North and Northeast Portland, this is still the heart of the black community in Portland, because the black institutions that were created by and large to serve the black community still exist in that neighborhood, right? And again, folks are coming in from Outer East, from Gresham, from Vancouver to access those institutions, those services, right? I did this presentation for a group of high school students out in Outer East, and one of the students said, oh yeah, I try and go home every weekend. He meant to North Portland, right? He wasn't born in North Portland, right? He was born, in Outer East, or he had spent the vast majority of his time there. But when he said, I try to go home every weekend, he meant North and Northeast Portland. And I think that that's incredibly important, that it is not just about the numbers, it is about the fact that even if there were no black folks who lived in North and Northeast Portland, this is still the heart of the historic black community, and there is a responsibility of the city to recognize that and to support that, and to support the folks who are trying to, strengthen that and to build from that.
Yes, just to amplify on that, there's a lot of money in giving the black community the Disneyland treatment, like Thelonious Monk played here, and viewing it as a place that used to be the black community. I think that developers look at that and seize on that as something that's a plus economically for them. And I think that the city has to be more proactive when this sort of development, like Trader Joe's, is being done, to find out what they can do to keep the community in the neighborhood and not run it out.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Is this presentation being made to decision makers, leadership, and by that I mean city council, PDC, the different bureaus of the city that have some impact on where the money goes and how it's being utilized? Because I mean, if average people, if a few average people, hear about this, the impact, is minimal. If the leadership, people actually doing things, realize that it's not just a 5-year or 10-year, 15-year history, that there's coordination between PDC, the business community, transportation when they built I-5, all those, organizations working together, there won't be much of a change.
Do you want to?
I would hope that they were going to see this, and I also would hope that they would care. My impression of a lot of how best should I say this? That the PDC is basically running a charity for corporations and wealthy developers, giving these enormous breaks that don't bring anything to the community that they're moving into. And part of the reason that I have so many of these photographs is a friend of mine who actually was the property manager of Vanport, and later was in the development commission. And it's from him I got all these photos. And I'll tell you what his attitude was. The day that the Vanport flood happened, dike broke, he was up on Mount Hood skiing. And he just kept on skiing. He didn't care. He thought that was it. So it's getting people in the city government to care. That's, I think, the biggest obstacle.
And I want to echo that. And I just want to say, I have immense faith in average people. I think actually, for me, when you look at this timeline, that's where change actually starts. That decision makers make changes based on, the will of the people, right? And in a democracy, ideally, that's how it works. Sadly, that's not necessarily what always manifests. But if we go back and look at every one of these positive changes that we can see in the timeline, and I haven't shown you the whole timeline, but a third of the timeline that I've created that you can see online are, our wins, our communities building together, our people creating the kind of country and state that we all want to live in. They start from the bottom with everyday average people building and saying, this is not what we want, and we're willing to stand up and do something about it. And so I believe that, we can't discount the work of average folks, because that's where, to me, all of the real change comes from. And I think it's through that kind of organizing a momentum that it becomes politically viable for folks in elected positions to shift some of their frameworks and policies.
I just want to put the discussion in a larger context by pointing to the fact that this is not the question of difference is not a black or Hispanic or certain segment of society's issue. It's a human problem. I remember when Einstein he was actually removed from a lot of the academic institutions that he was in Germany because he was supporting the Zionist cause. This was after the war, or even before the war. And he wrote something to the effect that if people who are in the majority will always find it difficult to understand the problems of the minority until there is a reaction from the minority of people. And that's why he became a Zionist. He supported the Zionist cause, and he came to the States and organized institutions, and they made provision for funds, which actually built the Hebrew University in Israel right now. So this is a human problem which we as human beings have to realize, that whenever the majority will always tend to suppress, either knowingly or unknowingly, suppress the minority. But it is the responsibility of the minority to react, to let those who don't see realize that there is something happening to other human beings which they may not be seeing. So this is not a black issue, it's a human problem that we have to be conscious of in every society that we live in, to know that people may not be in the situation in which we are, and listen to those issues, unlike the situation where you're talking about someone who's going to ski. They may not actually know what's happening with another person, just like, or in France, where Marie Antoinette was asked, why are the people crying out there? Say, well, they have no bread. Say, they have no bread, let them eat cake. So because they have no idea, they had no idea of what the people were suffering from. So until we react to situations like this, there will always be that tendency for people in the majority to either knowingly or unknowingly be on top of situations not actually that are not good for the rest of the population.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could speak to it seems like there's a lot of energy around equity right now, including the Portland plan, and that word is being infused, and I'm both encouraged. It seems like there's some intention and focus to do some work, but I'm also concerned that it may be, again, just sort of speak and superficial. Do you have any sense of kind of what's happening now, and if some of the work around equity that's being done has the potential to dig deeper and get at some of the underlying issues?
What are you talking about?
The term equity.
Equity?
Equity that is being used a lot, like the Governing for Just Racial Equity Conference recently.
Oh, okay.
Portland plan, yeah, there are a number of plans, there's equity lenses, a number of documents that are creating some frameworks for really doing the work. I'm wondering if they're being used, if it's happening, what perspective you might have on that.
I don't know if they're using any right now.
Yeah, I've seen the love of the word equity. I think again it's about defining terms clearly. I think that I've seen equity defined clearly in ways that I'm like, that sounds great, I support that. I've also seen it used in very vague ways like diversity that I actually don't have any idea what you mean when you say equity. So to me it's really about defining these terms and being very clear about it rather than just saying, well, everyone can kind of take what they want from it, right? Because again, that diffuses, I prefer the term justice because I think to me, it's a lot more concrete, and it often means that there will be transformational change for everyone. And I think that that's incredibly important, that to me, oftentimes equality or sometimes even equity is about saying, well, how do folks integrate and assimilate into this existing, white-dominated system? And I think that there are many areas where folks don't actually want to assimilate and integrate into that. And so for me, justice says, what is just for communities, and then how do we create that into being? I think we have time for one more comment or question.
I just want to make one comment and ask a question. You mentioned the day that a group of people made it happen, that the the real estate code, what was put in real estate code to keep black people away. That day of, I forgot what it was called. There was a day that group of people went to Senate.
Oh, in 2001, to repeal the racial exclusionary clause in the Constitution.
Exactly. we cannot mention that day without mentioning the name of the group, which was Uniting to Understand Racism. And I'm mentioning that because a gentleman was talking about how do we make, have this conversation and bring people. It was a group of, it was an interracial group that didn't start in 2001, it was 1999, that built this momentum till that day that they had to take so many of us went to Salem and actually packed the hall of Salem and made the people who were resisting it in legislature take notice, and they were forced. Margaret Carter, Yvette Godley, so many people were there to make it happen. So I agree that we have to take action. We have to be intentional. We have to have those difficult conversations, which in the city, you have to be very careful because courageous conversation in this city can label you. And so you can, I'm just saying that. The other part is when derailing conversation make it difficult for a community to heal, to move forward, which is what happened to POW. I think as black people, we should have conversation within ourselves that is clear, that we understand the goal, so that we do not make a group the fourth one to take the conversation away. Because that history, I asked a person when the POP and Trader Joe thing was going, do you know the history of this community? That conversation ended there because they didn't. But they had so much to say prior to that. So we need to ask hard questions. We need to force people to look at the history so they can know how to plan the future. So there's just so much in that timeline that need to be unpacked for those who do not understand.
Right. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's just one thing I really want to say about the 2001 repeal is that, I mean, it actually started, long before that, right? As soon as, the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, that work started here. That work started in the late 1800s. We have, folks like Beatrice Kennedy and the NAACP in the 19-teens and 1920s working to repeal the law, working to try and get that language out of the Constitution. We see this again and again and again in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, right? That I think it's important, again, that we have to take that long look and to know that those amazing folks who did that work that finally pushed it over the edge were standing on the foundations that were built, by folks who were facing down the Klan to do this, who were facing down a Klan governor and saying, you need to repeal this language from the Constitution. And, we are all standing on that legacy, every single one of us. And so it's incredibly important, again, to see that long scope.
I'd like to say thank you so much to all of you for coming. Let us clap our hands for Walidah and Thomas. Thank you so much. Thank you. On behalf of DEEP, I'd just like to say that we are so thrilled. Now, I'm like you. I don't think I need a mic. But on behalf of DEEP, I'd just like to say we are so thrilled that so many of you came out today. And it just indicates to us that people are eager to have conversations. And perhaps we'll have to do a round 2 of this at some point in time in the future. Thank you so much. They're going to kick us out of here, so we have to go. Thank you.